So then I would say we slowly get started. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I'm like, with the new tool, we're still having some trouble. I think the people that are coming from Meetup are like, not able to join currently as the room closes itself for the sign up. So if everyone knows, but there's no shelling or nothing. So we have Damien here as well. As you can see, I would just say we're getting started, and like whoever joins in. Second round of the Munich Friends of Figma group. So tonight we are having two talks, one by myself. I'm gonna talk about how to create and structure a scalable design system. Hey, Damien. Now here it is. I'm going to talk about how to create and structure scalable design systems. So I'm going to keep it really practical. I'm going to give some insights on how to best structure components, on like quick tips on like how to work with components. And then afterwards, Damien is going to pick up the topic and he's going to provide you with some insights on like how to improve web accessibility in components, and also how to document design, or like better said, design systems and components to hand them over to developers. So we're looking at a pretty interesting night. I'm still missing the whole like offline event flair with like beer and like actually chatting and seeing all of you people. But somehow, due to the coronavirus, we still have to be remote and have to make it work that way. So thanks all for coming out. I think, Damien, maybe you want to give like a quick introduction to yourself, and then we get the ball rolling right away.
Yeah, sure. I never know how to present myself. It's always, I think, the most difficult exercise. I will tell also a bit more about myself at the beginning of my talk, but basically, hi, I'm Damien. I'm a designer / engineer. Let's say I'm a tech worker, a web worker, if someone wants to make the joke with our dear browsers, working with design system and web accessibility. French people, so I hope that you will be able to bear with my delightful French accent. And I will try to discuss really more with you about how can we improve web accessibility without any technical discussions. So usually web accessibility, and the reason I really like this topic, is because it is a bridge between technical and purely design decisions. But most of the time when we hear about it, it's about markup, HTML, CSS, decision with JS, and so on. So today I really want to take a few minutes to discuss with all of you how we can, as designers, create the path that is making a product accessible, even if we don't discuss at all the technical reality behind at the moment.
Awesome. We'll love to hear that one. Cool. Just give me 1 second. I'm trying to get some of the people in. Cool. Just give me 1 more minute. I will try to get some of the Meetup people in here as well. One little second, and then we will get started with the first talk from my side. I will just add a comment in the group. Perfect. So let me introduce myself as well. I haven't even introduced myself properly. So I'm Philipp. I'm working, and I'm like the co-founder and working at MVST. MVST is a digital product studio in Munich. So we build, design, and work on everything that's digital. So no matter what it is, like an online web platform for SaaS B2B business, or like mobile applications for various use cases. I've been designing myself for like almost 10 years now. Have been leading various design teams in bigger and smaller companies, and have always been a big advocate of like introducing proper design systems, being able to like work efficient with the design team, And therefore, my talk is gonna be about how to create and structure a scalable design system inside Figma. So I'm gonna be really specific about the Figma tool. I'm not gonna jump into the tool, but I have a lot of screenshots and GIFs prepared for you. So you will see all the cool quick tips that I have prepared for you. A little bit about the structure of the talk. So first, I'm gonna keep it very short on the general, like, hey, like components, how do components work? How do they look? And then I will bring it down to some like really hands-on tips and tricks about components, like how to better structure them, how to actually better create them. I bet there are a bunch of tips in there that you haven't heard so far. And after that, I'm gonna talk about like, hey, how do I structure the design system as itself? So not only the components, but the components within the design system. How do I structure that? How do I go about it? Do I do it in one file? Do I do it in multiple separated files? And I'm going to talk about the whereabout of those. So I see a whole lot of more people joining. I think that problem with the meetup group is now hopefully solved. At least that's what I think. So let's jump right into it. So the first question your blink is working again now. Awesome, perfect. Sorry for the issue. The new tool somehow didn't want to do what I wanted to do with it. So also welcome to the late joiners, and we will jump right into the first task, into the first talk of this evening. Let's go. How should I create a component, or when should I create a component? So that's something that I have experienced throughout my career a lot of the times, like, hey, when is actually the right time to create a component for my design system, or like for my designs in general? I've prepared a little checklist with only 3 elements that should be enough to actually give you the right guidance. So are you early in the design process? Yes. No. So if you're early in the design process, then yes, for sure, definitely, you should already start to thinking about creating components. And the earlier you create components, the quicker you're going to be at the end of the design phase. Even if you know, like, hey, the design is rocky, and as you see also in the third checkpoint, the design may change. Yes, it may change, but you will already have a lot of screens. Like, think of mobile applications, think of web applications, think of lists that you are building. Like, sure, in the first iteration, you will never get like the right list element, and you will not know all of the whereabouts of the list. But if you have a design system or like a component for this list already in place, you're going to be so much quicker when, for us as an agency, when for us, as example, the client comes and like provides his feedback, we need to make changes. So are you early in the design process? Yes. Do you have elements across multiple screens? Yes. And the design may change? Yes. Then you should really already start thinking about creating components. I see a lot of designers and other people, they're postponing the creation of components to the very end. Like when they're selling, this is the final version, awesome, this is what we're going to build, and this is what we're going to ship. Then they start creating components. But in the meantime, they spend so much time reiterating screen over screen over screen. And yes, I can move my cursor for sure, screen over screen, and basically it just slows them down. So my quick tip is think about creating components right from the beginning. After you're coming out of a mock-up phase, already start about thinking which components might make sense. So how do you actually structure components? I didn't do a whole part on like the atomical structure of components, because at least I hope a lot of you people already know how to atomically structure components. So yeah, what is the deal with it? You always start off with the atoms, so being it the font, the colors, simple shapes, and then you going on and creating molecules out of these atoms. And on top of that, basically, you put the organisms. I hope this is like this has been out there for like a very, very long time, so I do not want to reiterate on that one. But I just want to remind everyone of like what a proper design system is basically built up on its foundation. And what I want to do in this talk as well is I want to give you a whole bunch of little quick tips that some might know already, but some might not know them. Quick tip number one for this evening, prefix components with a underscore or a dot will not be published. So think about, you create in your design system a whole bunch of shapes, right? Like you have a circle for your avatars, you have a rectangle for your button, but you don't want to have that shape being published as the standalone shape. Just put a prefix on it and it will not be published in your library. And another tip, or another first component tip that I have for you is build separated components. Something I see a lot of the times is that people overcomplicate the nesting of certain things. So when you have a proper design system, what you will for sure have is you will have a whole bunch of variations for your buttons, for example. So you will have a normal state, a pressed, focused, or a disabled state. And a lot of people trying to squeeze all those states into one component. I'm on the backside of that. I would rather say, like, create separate components for these states. I'm going to talk later a little bit about it, like how you make them bulletproof in terms of like text overrides. But in general, create separate components. It's way easier for the user to navigate through your design system. It's way easier to maintain because you also see all the variations, so they're not hidden. And yeah, as said, like it's easier for the user to navigate and find the right style that he want to use for his specific task. So in general, when should I create a component? Right from the start. How should I structure it? Atomically. And like, how should I deal with different states? Create different components for each. I have a whole bunch of more best practices for components that I want to run you through and that are super related to Figma. I hope that will really like spice up your components in the future. The first one that I have is preserve text overrides. So the simple and easy trick is if you have buttons with different states, just make sure that the text that you put in there, that the naming of the text, the label, is called the same. If you do this, the text override will just be persistent whenever you switch the state. So it doesn't, as you see in the GIF, if you call all the text label in all your buttons, you can simply override it and nothing will happen to your text. It will basically always stay the same. And this holds truth for like all other components as well. So just simply name the text layer the same across your components, and text override will work as simple as that. One that is absolutely neglected, which I have never seen a lot of people use, add descriptions. So normally on the right side of your Figma panel, you have in the component, you have a little text box where you can add descriptions, and yeah, use them. These just pop up every time you hover over one of the components in the components area on the left side of Figma, and they just give you information like, hey, when should I use this specific component? And put in like, hey, what state is this? Put in like, for which platform is this button actually? Like, is this for desktop? Is it for web? When should I use it? That just helps people navigate through your design system. And a quick tip is, which I have not known about for a long time, this description will also show up in the code section for developers. So when developers inspect your designs, they only have the viewing rights, so they will use the edit tab, the code tab. They will see these descriptions, and basically you can guide them with this description on your components and make their life easier. I'm pretty sure Damien will have a whole bunch of like things that would fit perfectly into this description. So I'm keen on his talk afterwards and like even enhance the description of the components. The next best practice that I have with you is really use layout grids and constraints. Like Figma is really, really great in building auto layouts and like building proper layout grids and constraints for basically every component. And I've, again, like seen them barely in use a lot of the times, but they are so handy. Once you get the hang of it, you can really do magic with it. You have one component that you can like easily use across platforms, and that you can use with all the different contents and content types that you have. So this is, look into layout grids and constraints. You can do magic things with it. Which brings me to my next best practice that I also haven't known for a long time, but clipping content and like actually being able to use the clip content functionality in a proper way, as you see, for example, with this list. It happens a lot of the times that you're creating designs, you want to mimic some scrolls, you want to have different heights of different elements, but you don't want to create different components for all the different height versions. So this is perfectly for clip content. As you see, the rows of the table are just moving underneath the footer and being clipped underneath it, and you can just easily use it on multiple screens and resize it as you like. So another great functionality that you can make a lot of use of. Some more tricks and tips for components. Styles and libraries. I think everyone that has been using Figma, yes, I can make it bigger. I hope that's better now. Styles and libraries. So what does that mean? I've brought you an example. Actually, I can't make it bigger. I'm sorry. It always goes back to the default size. And MVST base. So I have a little base design system that I'm going to show. And what you see in the top is basically you see all the different font sizes, you see all the different colors, you see the shadows, and you see the layout grids that are basically part of the design system. So you not only publish the components that you have built, but you publish the actual styles that you've created beforehand in your library. This just helps you basically keeping everything consistent across. And a lot of people that are coming from Sketch, like I did, there was never this functionality where you could actually have like colors that are not sitting inside a rectangle or for something like that, and to actually be in the library. And this like completely changed with Figma. So be sure to create and manage your colors and your color styles in Figma, because they're going to be shared with your design system, and they just make you keep consistency across all your designs. But a question that I've received also quite often, and that I always face with the clients: how do I call my colors? I have like basically 3 different types that I like to follow. It always depends a little bit. But the one thing is group colors by hue. The second thing is group colors by theme or type. So theme or type could be you have supporting colors, you have like gray colors, you have variation of black colors, and then I think and hopefully Damien is going to touch base on the accessibility of colors as well, and group accessible colors together, like which of the colors are like have the best accessibility, which have the lowest accessibility, could also be a way of actually grouping them and making them accessible. I brought a little just a little showcase. So on the left side, you can see the colors by hue, for example. So with 0%, 25, 50. So basically it's opacity in this case, but you could make it work with hue as well. In the middle, we have it grouped by theme. So we have support colors, green, yellow, red, and blue. And yeah, actually forget about the black, that just sneaked in there. And on the right side, you have them more in a, how should I say it, in a written named like fashion. So gray light, gray lightest, gray neutral, dark, and darkest. In general, there are many options on how to group colors. What I always also advise people is have a chat with your engineering team and like use the same description and tokens that your engineering team uses for the colors, because this will make communication way easier. This will again like make your design system flawless across platforms, like from Figma to the design team. Then the second question that I get a lot is, how do I call my types? Like, hey, how do I call my font styles? And here again, like 2 quick tips: group type styles by the font family. Like if you have multiple font families, most of the design system only have one. So then I would go with the second option, which will be group type styles by size. What I mean by that is, yeah, you could do something like that. You might have web platform specific sizes. So what I did is, in this case, I have a specific group that's like for the web platform. There would be another one for the mobile platform. And then you either make it by bare sizes, so you write down like how many pixels it has, or if you want to be like a bit more abstract, you can go with like H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 with some body fonts and small and tiny, which always gives a bit of a description for where and how the font should be used right away, than just having the pixels of how big the font is. And one of my absolutely favorite tips and tricks is, we all have been there, like we are designing for a cool product, but we need sample images. Thankfully, with Figma, we have a nice Unsplash plugin where we can like load different kind of images. But, and that one I didn't know, you can create color styles that are actually images. So in your library, you can already define a whole bunch of images as color styles, which you can apply to all different kind of shapes and forms. So as you see here on the right side, you see the color style panel, and you actually see the placeholder images. So you could create persons, you could create, as you see here, some scenery shots. And what the nice thing is about Figma, the layer that you have selected, whether it's a rectangle or a circle or an oval, or like even an icon, you can fill it with this image. So it's very handy to just create a whole bunch of like placeholder images, placeholder things in your design library. And as we have learned before, with the shared library and with the color functionality, these placeholder images will also be shared for all the users that are using your design system. One of the most awesome thing I have found quite recently. And then last but not least, for the tips and tricks, layout grids for visualizing spacing. So as you see here, for example, we in our agency, we develop a lot of products, and we trying to keep the spacing consistent with our engineering team. So what we also do is we use the same tokens that the guys are using in the code to actually distribute spacing. So padding extra small, medium, large, everything based on an 8-pixel grid, for example. And you also can create the viewport grids on top of that. So you're really like bulletproof, and you can really be sure that your designs will look like the engineering team is building it. And with the spacings, especially, you also ensure consistent spacing across all the designers that are working in your team, because they're using the same design library. And once they're used to using the spacing, you will really have like 100% consistency across all your designs. Coming to one of the biggest question, and like to the most trickiest one, how do I actually organize my libraries? So there are a couple of different ways. I've shown the two most obvious ones, which I want to give you a little whereabout. So should I put everything in one big library? So we as an agency, we are working with clients, and we are providing them with design system. And it's always the question like, hey, how big is the design library going to be? Should we put it in one library? Should we create separated ones? Here are like some of the benefits that a big library has. So it's only one library for the user. There's no confusion for the user of where he can find components, right? Like there's no like, oh, is it in the button file? Is it in the icon file? Like, is it in the web components or mobile components file? So there really is no question of where to find this stuff. And on one hand, it's also easy to maintain, because you only have one file. You don't need to worry about like having multiple files flying around. and that just makes it simple, at least for us, for an agency, handing it over to clients as well. If we as an agency are working on a product, it might be very hard for the customer and for the client to getting used to multiple file complex design system. So for that case, I would always say like, hey, yeah, let's go with an easy one big library, having everything in one file, because the clients can just work the best with. But for big product focused companies, that's a different game, and I'm going to talk about that just in a second. What are the downsides of a big one file everything library? It can grow very, very quickly. Like, I mean, some companies, they have like customer facing products, they have like business partner facing products, they have a mobile platform. All of these platforms have somewhat the same components, but also have different components. So the library will grow very, very quickly. And if you don't watch out, it can get very unorganized. Also, downside is you can't cherry pick. So for example, hey, I just want to use the buttons, or hey, I just want to use the mobile components. You just can't cherry pick these libraries. You have to take it all. And yeah, that's also the last point. So all the platforms are in one library, which means there is no distinction or like proper structure between like, I don't know, mobile iOS, mobile Android, or like mobile and web components. So there's really everything in one file. But as said, I think for smaller projects and for agency projects that are handing over the products and to clients that are not used to work with like multiple file libraries, I think one file is always a good solution. But the second options, and obviously that's also one that is known, especially in bigger companies with like bigger design teams, separate libraries. So here in this example, you see desktop components, you see mockup components, platform, mobile, or even just helper components. So here, like everything is really distributed and everything sits inside a single file, and basically that is managed separately. What are the benefits of that? You can only enable required libraries. So I only need the brand asset because I'm just creating something, or I only need the mockup library because I'm just mocking something quickly. As you've seen as well in the example, you can split the platform between platform, mobile, and desktop, for example. And you have the benefits of small files, which means like the files are very dedicated to one specific use case, which makes them also, or maybe even easier to maintain. And you could have specific people that are taking care of each of these files, which makes it very, very easy to structure and like keeping the design system up to date across all the different platforms. So especially in big product organizations that are like heavily focused on building one digital product, splitting up the library makes a lot of sense. But it also has some downsides. Obviously, the most obvious one is more libraries to manage, right? So if you're creating 10 of them, you have to manage 10 of them. So that's also a downside. And for new people that are joining your company, it could be hard to find components. So the onboarding needs to be spot on, that everyone is able to find his components, find his way around. And yeah, that's like another downside that can be worked against. So yeah, in general, there is no right answer to like, do I do it in one file or do I do it in multiple files? But as said, smaller projects, agency projects that you're handing over to customers, always go with one file. It's always easier for the client. If you're working with a big organization in a big team with like multiple designers, try to go for a separated approach. It will benefit you in the long run because you can maintain it more easily. But how do I actually organize my components? So we have talked about components beforehand. We have like seen some tips and tricks about the components, but how do I structure them? How do I organize them in the library? And in particular, how do I organize them in Figma? The old pattern that we know that we have, some of us, I guess, like a lot of people are coming from Sketch, and that we have been using with Sketch is like just / naming, like button / primary / default, button / primary / hover. Like this will give us a nice structure, and this will help us having all the different states and all the right things in the right places. But as you see, like at the bottom examples, button, second, hover, this can lead to very, very long namings. And as you know, in design tools, we only have like a limited space of like 300 pixels where we actually see the titles. So that's why in Figma, you can use a different approach with pages and frames that, yeah, is reflected as the structure in your design system. So as you see in this example, let me zoom in a little bit so you can better see it. You have in the middle the pages, for example, the button page, which basically is reflected in your design system on the left side as a hierarchy point called buttons. Then what you do is you create frames. So you see a frame for primary buttons and you see a frame for secondary buttons. And as you see on the left side again, they're represented as sub-hierarchies of the buttons. And within the frame, you're actually then hosting your components. And the components don't have the full / naming. The button is just called normal, pressed, focused, or disabled. And because it's in the frame and within the page, it is getting sorted in the right category and in the right hierarchy. And this basically allows you to have shorter names, or like basically readable names, and without having to deal with the backslashing naming throughout all of your components. And this really helps you keeping a nice structure of your design system. And this also already brings me to the end of my little talk about design system and the organizing of libraries. I already see a question from Thijs. If the button doesn't get the full name, how do the developers know which button it is? That's a very good question. So one example could be that you use the description box that you have. That would be one example. And another one is basically they are also able to look at the design system, but only in the read-only state, because as you see right here in this example, they have a nicer structure as well, right? They see buttons, they see the frame primary buttons, and then they see the buttons shown in there. But I guess these two are the options. Like either you use the description panel to give them some more info about the button, or even use the same token as the guys are using in the code. Or you basically give them access to the design system, which they should have anyway. But I hope Damien will also pick up on that topic, on like how to technically, or like how to describe components and like how to hand over the components. Questions and from your side. Do the description panels. So I have two more questions. Do you have an example reference on the onboarding materials? I just read an article about that. I can share this afterwards with every one of you. It's like there was a really nice article of like how to onboard people and learn them, like the Figma whereabouts. So like even for product managers or like engineers, like how to get them on board. And then the other question from Thijs: do the description panels get displayed in the interfaces final designs? I'm not sure I can follow. So where it will be shown is it will be shown if you hover over the component, you will see the description. It will be shown if you click on the component in the right side in the edit panel. And it will also be shown for engineers or for everyone who is viewing the design in the code panel. So these are the three places where the description is going to show up. Perfect. Any more questions? Doesn't look like it. Perfect. You are welcome. I hope that helped a lot of you in like being very specific about some tips and tricks and some whereabouts. So yeah, just as a little side note, so we are always hosting some workshops at MVST. So about like Figma and design system in particular. The next one will be at the 22nd of November. There's still 5 slots available. I don't want to be any saley right here, but if you're interested in learning more about Figma, learning more about design system with like me actually being in the system and like teaching you like write in Figma, just reach out and I will shoot you all the information that is necessary. With that being said, that was my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you could take something away with it. And yeah, sadly, there's no break and no beer and no chatting like with the offline events. So not boringly, I'm very excited for the talk of Damien, but I would love to engage a little more. But with that being said, and like saving everyone's time, I would hand over to Damien. I'm listening into his talk about improving web accessibility through better design documentation. And yeah, hope you will enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Now let's hope that things will work correctly on my side. Let's hope that Chrome is... Yes, yeah. You should be able to see my slides. And my system with an iPad as a speaker device is working quite nicely so far. So thank you, Philipp, for your talk. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. So, I will definitely be a bit less on Figma and a bit more about documentation as a whole. But the good thing with documentation is that the tool matter not so much. And the good tool, in a way, will be the tool that can be applied to your system. So the best way usually to provide an easy way for people to create documentation is to make sure that they can do documentation where they are currently working. That's one of the big elements that I think all companies or all systems are trying to solve. That was the case, for example, on the engineering side with things like Storybook or similar tools that try to offer at the same time the place where engineers can create their components and at the same time being the place where people would get information, technical information about the implementation of the components. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate lately with all design tools is the step forward that was done to provide ways to comment, ways to add information that is not always part of the design itself, but providing meta information about it, which is more than important if you want a really step-free, barrier-free collaboration between people in a project. And barrier-free collaboration between people in the project is mainly what we'll discuss today with improving web accessibility through better design documentation. Because in a way, the best way to bridge the gap between designers and engineers is to do that through collaboration, documentation, and accessibility can often be the way to do that. So now let's see if even this works. And the remote does not work. Nice. Yes, it works. So in a really small presentation. So as I said, I'm Damien. I'm a queer web worker that is living currently in Berlin. I'm initially a French person. I lived in the Netherlands, in Sweden, and so on. I was a bit all around the globe, but I really love the city of Berlin. So I'm quite glad to be there now. I'm using they, them pronouns as I'm identifying as an agender person, and I'm definitely an LGBT activist. And when I have a bit of time, when I'm not complaining about LGBT or queer issues, I'm also a design system consultant and web accessibility specialist. So I'm mainly helping companies that are product focused to create design systems through which ones they can easily improve the web accessibility for their final users. So it is as much on the design than the engineering side, because it's really about what can we do to improve the consistency and the accessibility of our interfaces. And if you want to discuss anything that I will say today, or just to continue the discussion after, I'm on Twitter with my handle @IamEwaddle. And As you can see this in the presentation with like the name of my studio, racoon.studio, I'm in love with raccoons. People try to explain to me that I should stop having GIFs of raccoons in my presentation, so I'm trying to not do that anymore. But yeah, raccoons are just wonderful animals. So the reason why I'm trying to discuss a lot with designers about web accessibility, and not only engineers, because too often the discussion is centered on engineers. And in the end, designers are also guilty for non-accessible interfaces. So web accessibility is really about design. And when I'm saying design, it's not just colors. Like a good design with amazingly contrast colors will not necessarily make an accessible design. Let me fix that, sorry. A really bad design, even with good color contrast, will not necessarily make an accessible design. There is no good design if you don't create something that is accessible and inclusive with people. And engineers cannot make a product accessible even with all the willingness in the world if the design initially was not built to be accessible. And that's why we're often pushing the accessibility as a technical requirement. We're often saying that the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are about what engineers have to achieve in order to make an interface accessible. But in fact, even with the best willingness, if you don't provide, as designers, all the elements that will help them building an accessible interface, it will not create an accessible interface. So that's one of the issues. And to understand what we all can do, let's go back to basics. And the first thing to understand about accessibility is what are the 4 focuses, the 4 principles of accessibilities. It's called POUR. And the idea is that to be accessible, your product, your website, your experience, because it is not only applied like something that you can apply to the web industry, but as a whole, must be first perceivable. It's the idea that when you create an experience, people should be able to perceive the information that you're offering to them. Most of the time, when we're building web interfaces, it means that the content that you're creating must be delivered as a text at one point to another. If you're creating a video, if you're creating images, if you have audio recordings, it means providing an alternative that will be available for people using, for example, screen readers, or as shown in the picture, a Braille platform that is mainly used by people having vision impairments. It also needs to be operable. And the idea here is that not only you need to perceive the information, you need to be the person that will receive the information, but you also, for that, need to be able to operate the website. You need to be able to achieve actions, to find information, and just to have something that will work, whatever your media is. And I like this picture. It is the Xbox adaptable adaptive controller. And that was the project made by Microsoft for the Xbox console in order to provide to people a way to operate video games regardless of their specific abilities. You don't have thumbs? That's okay. We can provide other kind of interfaces, in this case, that are push buttons, or that would be pedals, or that would be any kind of other interface plugged into this adaptive controller. And not only the idea was to offer a functional controller, the idea was also to work about everything. Because to be operable, you first need to open the box. And once you open the box, you absolutely need to be able to get it, to take all the objects, and to plug everything. So what they try to do is to remove as many of the steps and the steps creating issues as possible by having, for example, a package with just one small piece of plastic that you can push. It is entirely opening the box, and you have an easy way to just get the controller and so on and so on. This is not a technical implementation. Those are a set of design decisions. Your content also needs to be understandable. And this one might be also the one that is the most relying on designers, because it's really about what do you do with your content to make sure that people will be able to get it. It is about providing meaningful text when you have icon-only buttons, for example, in a way or another. It is about making sure that the content that you're offering will be understandable by people that are not having, for example, English out there as their first language. Or it can also be about just making sure that people are having all the information that they need in order to assess what they have to do, to not be lost in your content, to know what is expected from them. All this kind of information are things that designers should decide on. And the last one is being robust. It's the idea that the experience that we're building is something that we will put out in the world and that we will not have a full control on. So we have to make sure that what we build will be usable whatever the device being used by the person is. And I'm not only speaking about sizes. I'm also speaking about all the people that are using overrides of colors, overrides of font files, overrides of like removing all the ads, removing some of the blocks, removing some of the animations that could hurt them. It is also about making sure that what we are building will work with people that cannot have a screen, that are using all the assistive technologies. It is mainly a technical one, but designers also have their say on a lot of the topics covered by this one. So that's the 4 principles of what a web accessible experience is. And all those principles are about design. So as I said before, for like the perceivable principle, we have to think a lot about text alternative and time-based media. So there is a lot of questions that are often not really answered in a project. The first one is, are text alternatives part of your copywriting process? And obviously, we're all thinking, when I'm saying things about text alternatives, about images. But already this one, like often, who is writing the alternative text for your images? And even worse, who is doing so for your audio recordings or your videos? If you have infographics, it's the same. What is the alternative? But it's also the case when you have, for example, data table. Like data table can be really difficult to navigate for people using screen readers. So do you have any kind of a summary that is being shipped with it so people knows what to expect from it? If you have a date picker, the text alternative, it's also about the invisible text. Everything that makes sense when you see the component, but not always when you like operate it using your keyboard, which is bringing me to the second question. Is your content still making sense when there is no visual clues available, when you're using screen readers, or just when you don't have a screen? In a date picker, if I'm just after a tab saying like something like 14, does it make sense? You don't have any other context, so 14's of what? And also, for a lot of these rich medias, images, videos, audio recordings, infographics, data table, and so on, maybe not the data table one, but are you requiring from all your partners creating videos, for example, to deliver the closed captions so you can make those available right from scratch with your video? Is it the case for your audio recordings? Like all these kind of things that we often externalized. Is it part of the brief? If not, why? Because you are not only pushing away people that cannot hear, for example, for a video, but you're also pushing away all the people that cannot just activate the sound on their computer because they're working in, okay, they're not working in an open space right now, but there could be one day again in the future working in an open space and not being able to push the sound. So all these kind of things must be pushed in your brief and are the kind of things that you cannot expect from engineers. Engineers are not copywriters. And if you have copywriters, definitely text and alternatives on them. But if you don't, usually it's falling on designers because they are the people that should also fight for our users. But that's not the only thing. You also have other questions in the fact that you must make everything perceivable. It's the idea that everything should be adaptable and distinguishable. And I'm pushing this with this image. This image is something that as an autistic and ADHD user, I'm using a lot. I'm using on my Firefox a tool that is trying to apply the same color scheme on all websites because it's helping me to find more easily all the information that I want to quickly see on the page. All the links are having the same color, whatever the website is, like it's just more predictable for me. So it means that if your information was only relying on color, I will never get this kind of information because I'm more than sure that the color that you decided to use will be overwritten by my system. But also, are you really offering a way for people to navigate the content without difficulty? Are you making sure that foreground and background are really different? Are you making sure that you're not putting ads and blocks of unrelated content in the middle of your content? Because all of that, even if visually you're like, yeah, it's only 300 pixels that are annoying. No, because for other users that are, for example, using a text-only mode in their browser, or that are using screen readers, it is something that will cut the content, and that might make really difficult the access to the next paragraph of your content, for example. And I see the question about what tool is it used. It's called Midnight Lizard. It's a plugin that you can install in Chrome and in Firefox, I think in Safari too, maybe. I'm not entirely sure for this one. But yeah, Midnight Lizard. And there is a plethora of different themes. The one I'm using usually, it's not this one because this one is really making my ass crying, but the one I'm using usually it's called, I think, Dimmed Dust, and it's a really shade of grayish kind of colors just to avoid having bright colors being on my face all the time. A lot used by, as I said, autistic users, but also used by dyslexic users, for example. It's the same with screen readers. I'm just taking this as an opportunity to just remind to people that not only people with vision impairments are using screen readers, but autistic people, dyslexic people, ADHD people, for example, can also use screen readers to be able to parse the content and to go directly where they want to go. And it's the case for a lot of the cognitive impairments. So people with cognitive impairments. Then it needs to be operable. And it means mainly for me offering barrier-free experiences. And the first thing to try is keyboard accessibility. And one of the things in the documentation is, for example, did you plan the keyboard navigation throughout the page? When someone is hitting your tab key, it is also part of the experience. We're doing flows where we're expecting people to move from steps to step. We cannot expect the move on tab to be relying only on engineering decisions, because it is part of the experience that we're trying to offer to our users. When we have a date picker like in the picture, we are doing this for mouses, explaining that when there is a from to, I want my mouse to click on the first one, and it's not a good number, but whatever. And then with the next one, I will click and I will have this kind of blue, and light blue between them. How does it work on a tab navigation? That's the kind of thing with the tab order that would be expected also, in my opinion, from designers, because sometimes we just don't want, like, we want to stick as close as possible to what is being displayed, but sometimes it makes more sense to push some icons providing help at the end of the process and the steps of your time navigation. So you have just power users or keyboard users being able to achieve more quickly the tasks that they're trying to achieve. But also, keyboard navigation means, do we have a usable focus state? Is it something that each component is having? Like, do we know how it should behave with the keyboard, how it should look like? And we have this usually for hover interaction. We have a lot of hover interaction in our design, but do we also provide alternatives for that? Like, how does it work? Is it when we're focusing, for example, on an icon, that automatically a tooltip appear and a screen reader will read the content of it? Is it more like when people are focusing on it and entering a key like enter, for example? Like, these kind of things should be as close as possible to standard in our industries, and the Web Accessibility Initiative of the W3C is offering through the the APG, basically a lot of information about the interaction that is expected on kind of standard components, like, for example, a dropdown, and what should happen when you hit the tab key, what should happen when you hit all the arrow keys, what should happen when people start to type, for example, in a dropdown. As designers, one of the things that we would maybe expect is, if I'm starting typing down a word, I'm going directly to the option that is matching this specific word. So all these kind of things are already described into like the APG of the W3C, and we should try to stick as close as possible. But it's not always existing for all the different components that we're trying to build. And yeah, and that's my last point with how the focus should behave in complex components. Next to that, we should also be careful with the navigation that we're providing to people. Like, can we easily identify what is expected from me as a user? Can I do that? Or also just, where am I on a journey? Is there breadcrumbs, for example, or these kind of things? And if there is a breadcrumb, what should it display? And this is also a design decision. Should it display all the pages in the hierarchy to this page, or should it display more information about the step in a process? Like, all these kind of things are design decisions that are often overlooked, and that we should be more that we have a more close look at, especially as designers. And one of the other things is, for me, really important is, can the content be found easily? And by this, it's not about being able to quickly search for it. Is there different ways to access it? Because we have a tendency, especially designer, to provide flows where we say, hey, users will start from here and then going to step 2, then to step 3. But this is your ideal scenario. And people, especially with cognitive impairments, might not have the same way to think about a problem. And even without cognitive impairments, dyslexia, for example, is well known to offer usually to have people finding unorthodox ways to solve problems. So what you predict to be the flow for a task might not be the flow used by everybody. So as designers, we also have to make sure that every time we try to make a content being easily findable, it is done by more than one way. It can be a search, it can be alternate navigations, it can be quick accesses and all these kind of things, related links for several pages and so on. But we have to make sure that people are not ending in dead ends. On the operable side, there is one thing that I think rely a lot also on designers. It's the fact that we should offer safe navigations. And this one might is touching the accessibility question, but also the inclusivity one, because it's about, first, when we're providing animations, for example, or just transitions, are we making sure that we're not just designing one, but we're also providing either an alternate one, or a documentation on what should be removed for users that request reduced motion or reduced transparency in their operating system settings. There is also a lot to be careful with, especially with videos or animation, about not provoking any seizures. But we could take this one and also extend it, because it's not only about seizures, it's also about not creating discomfort. So it can be the case about audio recordings and videos where we want to make sure that there is no big difference in volume. One of the big examples that I always have is advertisements. We have a tendency to catch people's attention, to have advertisements like with a higher volume than the rest of the content. This is something that can provoke discomfort. In audio recordings, it's mainly about volumes and the kind of sound that we're transmitting. In videos, it's also about the colors and the frequency of changes of colors and brightness on a video and a screen. But it can also be about language. And that's where we also can push out on the discomfort side. Language can trigger issues to people, can create discomfort without warning. It can also create a lot of potential issues to people, going from anxiety attacks due to heavy stress issues because of social issues existing in our society. It can be about making people uncomfortable in like their own situation at the moment, creating fear and so on. We love to play with emotion. Designing for emotion is really a big topic in the last 4 years in our industry. But we also have to be careful that when we're designing for emotion, we're not designing to create discomfort to people. It's okay to stress a bit some situation when it's about deletions and like really important operations, but we still have to be careful that it will not trigger bigger discomfort for people having, for example, anxiety issues or depression and so on. So about the visual aspect of it, but also the language that we can use. We should also be careful with time-sensitive actions with several points. The first one is obviously making sure that we provide enough time for our users, especially if they are unfamiliar with the content to read or the action that they need to realize. But providing enough time does not mean you're like looking at your screen and being like, hey, I need 30 seconds to read this, let's put 45 seconds. No, it's about providing a way for people to stop things, to make sure that they have the time they need to either realize an action or to access the content. And if you really have to do time limitation, you have to inform your users ahead of time. And here too, it's a design decision on how. Is it about a message saying you have 5 minutes before completion of this thing? Or do you want something that will be more about letting people choose how much time do they want before a ticket being released again from the queue, for example? And it's about providing operable way to extend existing timer if possible. And even with all of that, it can also be nice to offer ways to, for example, add time when we see that we don't have time left. Adding time in a way that is easy to people at least. And to end like this overview of like what is accessible design before discussing really about documentation, the last big element of it is making our content understandable. First, with readability. I have a lot of talks about that, so I will not go more deeper on that, but is like a text is not accessible per se. So we have to be careful with what we do, avoiding technical language, for example, managing expectation of our user regarding the content, and making sure that the content is offered in a way that will be understandable, readable, like with good font size, good font family, spacing, layout for that, but also being understandable by non-native speaker. It can be through alternatives or using simple version of a language like simple English instead of English, or providing a small summary at the beginning of a really long content. But it's also about making sure that we are making things predictable. And here it's about the consistency. Design systems are all about consistency. And that's one of the way we can easily also improve the accessibility of things. Ensuring consistency in the layout, but also about how we inform our own complexity, dependency of tasks. Like if there is a 4 steps with a timer process that someone needs to complete, and you only inform them after 20 minutes on a 25 minutes process that they need their passport. If it's someone with kids, if it's someone that having like mobility issues, the time to just reach a passport might be bigger than the time that is currently left. Or if you have attention disorder, just the fact that you have to stop and to look for something else might just totally like remove you from the task that you're completing. So managing expectation ahead is a really good way to do that. And it's about also making things more predictable by explaining the meaning of icons, colors, and always keeping it the same throughout a process or a journey. And one of the last elements in the understandable is also how to help people. Error messages. That's something that is also relying a lot on designers to just make sure that the copy that we're providing, the experience that we're providing is understandable and not stressing people. It's also about making sure that we are not offering the assistance only through one channel. And that's also something more about service design, that UI design, but that's something made by designer. Just making sure that when people will be seeking assistance, we're offering a flow that is as efficient for each of the channels that we're offering. And for example, it means that when you are offering a product that is about, I don't know, deliver food to people, and that some of your people might be, for example, having any kind of hearing impairments, providing only a system that is by phone, like an assistant that is by phone, and providing only a way for people to be reached by the ring bell might not be the best way. And that's the kind of thing that we also have to make sure with our products, that we are always making sure that people are reached in a multitude of ways to not rely on only one sensor. And before discussing documentation, the last one, as I said, is robustness. And this one is a bit more technical one. So that's one that we will not go really into. But at least one of the questions that I would like to be raised in design groups, it's during the research phase, do you interview users with needs for assistive technologies and users that might not be at ease with technology? And that's something that when we're doing user interviews, when we're doing user testing, designers should be more proactive at. So just making sure that this is part, at least, of the thinking, and that when we're designing screens, we're always thinking also about the fact that not everybody is using the same date format or the same just left to right, and will it continue to work in other cultural situations? Whew. Sorry, that was a bit long, but I think that it's a really good thing to also see how designers can really have an impact on accessibility before discussing how we can document that. Because all these questions that are asked too often are unanswered. And even when we have an idea in our mind, it's usually not part of what we consider being the handoff to engineers. So web accessibility is about collaboration. And that's the really big thing that I want to push today. And the first thing is that the era of design handoffs is dead. We cannot rely on documenting like a screen and like providing a screen and being like, hey, please implement that. I mean, it's a lot of projects are still doing this, a lot of teams are still doing this, but it is raising more questions that it is really answering. And good products in the end result from an open and continuous communication. So user stories, sketches, prototype, we cannot provide design for all mediums and especially all usage. So we have a constraint here. The constraint is that the flat design on a screen will never be a good medium to document the invisible. And accessibility is really often about what is not visible. Let's take this component, for example, which is just the date picker that we discussed together. There is a lot of things that are not visible, but are design solution. Obviously, the first that we saw just before is how to select things on the keyboard. But also, if you don't have the visual feedback and you select a date and you, with your eyes, you would see the date being now part of the input, what is the message that should be read to people through a screen reader? Is it just pushing them to the input with the date being read, which is a really good answer? Or do you want to use more alert system where it would be a real message being read with date selected for and the context being explained and the date, for example, or the date and then the context being read after to explain what is this date about? But this is especially important if you have a from to, for example, situation where the focus would automatically move to like the next field, for example, and people without visual feedback would not see if the date was in the end the good one. So it's really important to see how, as designer, we can also try to provide this kind of experience and this kind of feedback to user. And this cannot be just put on a screen. So there is one thing better than documenting like that documentation. It's collaborating. And for all these kind of things, for example, a 15 to 20 minutes down with a designer, an engineer, and let's dream, a user might be helping a lot to document the invisible. Okay, during a development moment, the user, it's maybe not the most optimal, but having engineers that are trained to use screen readers, sitting with a designer can be the good moment to just hear what's happening and being like, hey, there is something wrong here. There is label missing. There is contextual information that I'm missing, alerts that should be read, and so on. But we can also develop new habits and just like start having more than visual information in our documentation. And one of the good things to do that is UI component documentation. In design systems, the idea is a lot to have for designers like this kind of design guidelines, but we also have the UI component library. And too often, this UI component library is really about, hey, I'm an engineer, I'm using React, I want to take my component and I want to know what are the props. But it's usually at this specific moment that we need more information and that we can define our accessibility requirements. One of the things might be with images to explain, as I said, the tab order. That might be something quite interesting. And what is happening when you're using your arrows? Like here, we're selecting the sex, we're moving with our arrows, and we can see like how the design would be. But to do this documentation, often it is just more complex than providing more images. So let's see this with a concrete example. Let's use a breadcrumb. It is a bit of a really annoying, like a really not shiny component. I mean, it's a breadcrumb. It's like 2 pieces of text and a slash in between. But there is already a lot that we can do for that. So first, we can start with when it should be used and when it should not. Because one of the things that we discussed with accessibility is about providing meaningful context. Sometimes a breadcrumb is not the most meaningful context when you're currently doing, for example, a step-based action. At least it's not the usual breadcrumb that you would see with the slash and that would give you the arborescence until a blog post. So I will show you a lot of examples from a lot of different design systems, mainly IBM, Shopify, so IBM Carbon design system, Shopify, Polaris design system, Microsoft Fluent, and I might forgot one of the example, but I will see. For example, here it's about just explaining when should we use this and when, for example, the progress indicator would be more relevant. It can also look like this. This one is the Atlassian. No, this one is the Microsoft one, sorry. That is explaining also the fact that breadcrumb should not be the primary way to navigate. It can be also about having best practices and small accessibility information, and the fact that, the breadcrumb should be synced with the page and the section that is related to. But that's not the only thing that we should provide. We can also provide information about terminology, because as I said, it's about like accessibility will a lot be about collaboration. So one of the first things that we all should do, in my opinion, is to just make sure that when we sing a component, we're all discussing about the same thing. Because in this case, it will be easier to after say that, hey, this information being currently the page link could be used also as a description for something that would be read on a screen reader. It's the case here with IBM. It's the case here with Jira. You can see that sometimes it's a bit different. There can be graphical elements or not, but it's just making sure that we're all speaking the same language. And once you have the best practices and you have the anatomy, like the way that we want to define our components, we can start discussing about discoverability, consistency, and guidelines on how to use it in layout. It's not applicable to all elements, but even something like a button might have a lot of information about the placement, because as I said earlier, accessibility is about creating consistency and the fact that something will be predictable. One of the things that should be predictable is where the submit button will be. You always want your submit button to be at the same position. This is the kind of placement information that might be really interesting for buttons. And for buttons, for example, if you have primary, secondary, and cancel action, what should be the order? What should be the difference between them? And also, how can we make sure that people will not do action by mistakes by submitting something that is deleting instead of adding information, for example. So placement and information are quite useful and also can improve the accessibility of a product. It's the case here with the placement on IBM. It's a bit different with, for example, Atlassian, that is trying to show more about how should you display the hierarchy path, especially when there is a nested hierarchy between pages. And once you have all this information, the documentation can also focus a lot about the interaction methods. Not only the mouse one, but also the keyboard and screen readers. For that, we can rely a lot one more time on the authoring practices that are the ARIA authoring practices. APG, are like authoring practices guide, yes. Thank you, I remember now. And like, in this case, we don't have to reinvent everything. But as I said, not everything is described by the W3C on that. And we might have to also make just clear that we have an easy way to navigate within it. And this expectation that is being written here, it's not only about keeping it in the long run, it's also about, in this case, offering an easy way for our QA specialists to write efficient end-to-end or interaction tests that will reproduce that, just to make sure that we're keeping things consistent, one release after the other. And we might also want to describe the accessibility acceptance criteria for this component. What we just saw is a bit the case, but we can have other considerations. And those considerations, one more time, should always be based on standard as much as possible, but that might be really helpful just also to make sure that we're not trying to reinvent all the time processes that are already existing for people. And once you have all of that, so yeah, well-tested decisions are really important and you should follow the authoring practices guidelines. Another example that I really like to have, usually it's just sending people, engineers or designers, thanks to related articles or related resources directly to the pages of the ARIA authoring practices. This one is a screenshot from it, and you can see that it's providing all the information as much for designers than it can provide information for engineers. And once you have all of that, you have all the basics for your components. And the good thing is that even if we now focus on slightly more complex components like a dropdown, we can just use everything we described earlier and it's still relevant. We just often need just more precise information. For example, when we were discussing about interaction for a keyboard navigation, a dropdown would be more complex. So we would also have to think about what's happening when, as I said before, people start typing multiple characters in rapid succession because they're looking for a specific option. And just making sure that we are having an idea of what will be the label announced by the screen reader when people will focus on our dropdown and open our dropdown, and that everything continues to work. One more time, this is a screenshot from the ARIA authoring practices. Really helpful for the keyboard support because it means that we don't have to think about it too much. We just have to make sure that what we're building is more or less working with this kind of pattern in mind. And next to all of that, we also have the questions of state management, and especially the error one, because there is a lot to not do with errors. And at the same time, here, we're really often relying on engineers to do that, when in fact, we should have more collaboration between the two sides of the river in order to make sure that we are dealing with the error management in a way that is really helping people. Even if it can be more complex to build, it's really about what is the most meaningful at one specific moment for our users, where the error message should go, and what should be read to people in order to have enough context to understand what they need to do, even if they don't have visual feedback from the website. It's about offering variations, making sure that the information is always provided, and sometimes, especially when errors are not just the HTML basic errors. I'm putting this example because the product that I'm mainly working on, we're having errors that can be, okay, the usual one, like the email address, for example, is not matching the standard of email addresses, but it can also be people being excluded for participating to a medical study. And in this case, it's about exclusion criteria. That is not just about it is not the good email address. It's you just really cannot continue in the process. So we have to make sure that when it is read through a screen reader, for example, we are providing the information that can be, for example, visually indicated by specific icons that I explained later or earlier in the flow, directly to the users, with a message being like exclusion criteria. This email domain is excluded from participating to the study, for example, and providing information about, in this case, what is expected from people. And here it's, you cannot continue forward into this process. It's about providing overt but also focused version and disabled version to make sure that every time we're providing something that is meaningful and accessible. And once we have all this information from a component point of view, it's also about like we can spend a bit of time, but in my opinion, we should not spend too much time on project-wide design decisions. But if you have the opportunity to discuss design, like project-wide design decisions, there is a few things that might be really interesting. The first one is structure and pattern guidelines. Atlassian is really good at this by providing, for example, what will be the full layout of the application at all time. And in this case, where should be your navigation, where should be your title, how do you handle the different blocks within it, and so on, in order that you're always providing a meaningful content. Working all together on these kind of foundations might take some time, but it will really help to improve your layout and the consistency of it throughout the project that you're working on. But you can also try to spend a bit of time to think about how the layout can be offered as a systematic solution. Like, for example, for empty states, you don't have to describe each empty state. You can just start creating a small information that is applicable to all empty states, saying, for example, that here the illustration is often considered decorative, so should be skipped by screen readers, and we don't provide alternative context. But also that we are having one action only to help people to understand what is expected from them on this empty state page. That can be one of the design decisions that is heavily related to how to create accessible interface. And at the same time, that is something that we cannot just rely on engineers on their own. So it's really about what is the experience that we want to offer to our users. So all this kind of decision can be quite interesting to have as patterns that would be project-wide. And you have more information about what should be done, what can be done about data visualization, for example. In the end, all of that is in order to create a robust experience that, that really rely on all these kind of guidelines. And if you really want to be robust, there is one thing that is really often overlooked and that we should have more focus on, which is focus guidelines. And here it's about not only just how it looks, but how it should move, and how can we just make sure that the order of elements on the page is meaningful. What do we do with advertisement if you're on a blog? Where should the focus be after some elements that are opening and closing modals, for example? When we're doing form validation, where should we go? Like first input right from the top of it, or staying close to the submit button within this kind of summary of all errors and these kind of things. That's the kind of project-wide guidelines that can be documented and should really benefit from that. We can see also it here with the Salesforce design system that is trying to have a set of guidelines that is applicable to all the error management for form elements, for example. And of course, I could not let you without talking about colors. I said at the beginning that accessibility is definitely not only about colors, but we have to discuss just a bit about it before ending this talk. And like, there is a lot we can do about colors. Usually, my tendency is less and less to document a long list of colors like this page can be, but it can be just sometimes useful providing all the colors. This is everything available to you, and does it pass or not? But often people will start making weird combinations that are not covered by your is it passing or not? So often I start to like more and more this kind of documentation, and I'm trying to do the same about cementing colors and what should be used and when, in addition to trainings that we're doing with people, so we make sure that people are always checking the contrast of their color. Providing the information is nice, but we will never be able to cover all the combinations that people will want to do, or the kind of illustration that people are building. But having this kind of grid, saying when you can use green for a really specific kind of message, and when you cannot because it would be not understandable enough, might be more helpful than just saying, here are all the colors that you want to give to people. Contrasts, like just, I'm showing this one just because it's an interesting one. It's one that I'm seeing a lot, but just seeing the contrast on white definitely is not really interesting. Like, because most of the time you will try to do combination of colors, and it can lead people to misunderstanding what the contrast is. Because if people start using your primary blue, like dark variation that we can see on the top, on a primary blue background, just for information that we don't want to be too visible, for example, the contrast will not be good enough, even if here we're saying that the contrast of the color is good. So we have to make sure that it is not always meaningful to provide information when people are not trained to understand what is exactly and how do we test the contrast of something. To avoid that, I really like what, for example, Carbon Design System did here by showing all the different information with what, like all the different variation with on the top, what should be the color being used for the text. That might weigh away, or when you're playing with transparency also, like when you can do it because it's accessible and when not. That might be a way to provide information. But if you have a really heavy in color, like a palette really with a lot of colors, that might be a lot of work and really difficult to document. So that's one of the things with colors. And yeah, and on colors like Figma, like all other design tools, are all offering ways, an easy way now to test the accessibility directly while you're prototyping. So just please rely on that and always check. It is often easier than just going back to the documentation and looking for the colors. And to like finish on this, for me, web accessibility is about testing and fixing. We will make mistakes. We are all doing mistakes. Like trying to make the web more accessible and inclusive is about shipping things that will not be accessible, because being 100% accessible does not exist. So we will do mistakes, and that's okay. We have to go step by steps, and please do not make too many big mistakes. Please trying to rely on standards, but it is okay to make mistakes and to fix things on the fly after, once you're getting users' inputs, which means that it's really important to get users' inputs and to see how we can improve what we're designing. And for that, there is one solution that I really like a lot, which is testing early, testing often. That's Intercom, that is having this really nice logic on design and collaboration between designers and engineers, showing that the reason why we should have designers and engineers working together, sitting behind the same computer, is because in this case, we can just discuss design decisions with the engineers, showing like what would be expected, then quickly making the change, firing up a screen reader, saying that it's still not really understandable, and then rethinking about how we can change that, and doing this kind of really iteration in loops. So for all of that, designers, engineers, and maybe users sitting together in order to really think about what is the information that we want to provide, not how good it will be in the end for people having visual capacities, but just what is the information that we want to provide and how can we make sure that it is accessible. And for that, even if it's hard as designers to think about it, because for a lot of time in our web industry, design was having the meaning of the visual element that we're designing and delivering in the end, we have to keep in mind that accessible UI components are about working with the invisible and being adaptable to any kind of devices, including the ones that are not having screens. And now it's on you. I mean, I hope that it was interesting for you and that you were having some information from this talk, that you were getting some information. I hope that it helped you to just broaden your view on what is making accessible component from a design point of view. That design is not only about what is visual, but really about what is the experience that we're building for people. Because if it is something that is on the top of your mind, it means that we can start creating more accessible interfaces and that we can integrate accessibility earlier in our processes and stop considering that design work is done once we're giving access to engineers to a Figma project or any kind of design deliverables without being heavily discussing with our main colleagues on an ongoing basis. Thank you. It took way more time than I would expected. I'm really sorry for that. I need to cut a lot within it, but yeah, it's just a really, really great topic to cover.
Thanks a lot, Damien. A round of virtual applause for Damien. I think that was a really, really, really amazing and a really deep dive into web accessibility. I think that is always interesting. And as you see, the chat didn't mind the long talk. I guess they're all happy and thank you for the awesome insights. So, are there still any questions that you want to ask Damien or myself? You're muted. I think you're on. Yeah.
There is a question about where and how do you usually provide the alt text for developers? That's a really good question. I did not I made the choice today to not put that in the slides because I was it's about accessibility, but in the end it is not. It's about how do you handle copywriting in your projects.
Yes.
And it is fascinating. I'm discussing a lot this in my company at the moment because we're discussing about how can we provide all the strings for internationalization in our project in a way that is, because we're shipping a lot of different products in a way that would offer consistency of language across products. And for me, the alt text is also part of what should be translated. So it is part of our discussion about copywriting and internationalization. So I would say the same way you're providing the copy for your design. And I hope that it is not through the designs that you're sharing with engineers, just for one point. It also depends on the context. If you're working on an agency kind of work where you're delivering screens for a project, or if you're working on a product team. But in product teams, often the copy is still changing while the engineerings are working on it. And it's something that is creating often a lot of differences between what is the design on Figma, for example, versus what is being shipped to people. So for me, we should not rely on our designs to provide copy anyway. It should be part of the user stories and like the tickets on Jira or whatever, or part of like, for example, just a spreadsheet with all the copies that are part of our applications. So we can easily do the translations, and we can easily just also see like the alt text everywhere. And for me, that would be the answer, especially because if the alt text is part of your usual way to handle copy, it means that you will not look over the alt text without doing it. Because people working on the copy will be like, okay, so there is this sentence, it's in this specific context, what should I provide? And the fact that it's visual or being read by screen readers doesn't matter in this case, because people are working really on what is the experience and the content that I want to provide with this. So I would say the same way that you're handling copy, and hopefully it is not through the designs on Figma.
Cool.
So yeah, like the question now is if there is any specific tool that support localization for translations, but also alt text at the same time. Like, there is a lot of tools that are handling copy, and I'm not really expert on that, so I will not answer, but I will answer on at least what, as a product, we're trying, like as a set of products, we're thinking about developing, which might be an answer to that. But because we want to offer all the strength to a set of different products, we're thinking about providing this either through a package or an API that is merged with the product on server side before being sent to the user. And because of that, we are currently thinking about using a CMS just to handle this. So copywriters, designers, and POs can sit with just like the usual, I don't know, like WordPress administration or whatever you're using to handle it and just to see the copy and update it. And then engineers can just access it by using the ID of the string. So that's the kind of custom tool that we're thinking about, because if there is a startuper that wants to start something in the attendees, that might be interesting to solve that. But I would really push the fact that I am not sure it's a good thing to explain to people too much what string is an alt text and what string is not, because a good alternative text might also be used visually after a picture and not just as a replacement for a picture. Or it might also be used as, in some context, the introduction paragraph of a page or these kind of things, if it's a really good one. So it's more about, I would more try to have a library of copy, of all the copy that we want to have on a product, having the context of it, the goal of it, and the goal is not being alt text, but being more like informative, short, and direct to the point, for example, and then having like the copy that you want for your specific goal with the specific requirement.
Cool. I guess that answers the question.
I hope.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks. Awesome. Cool. If there are no more questions, then that was it for the night. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed Damien's talk. I hope you enjoyed my talk. We're always looking for new speakers for our next round, so we will definitely host another round at the end of this year. So if anyone is interested in giving some insights about like Figma, about design systems, about accessibility, about collaboration, just feel free to reach out. Also, always, if you have friends that are looking to speak, happy to jump on a chat and yeah, let's have another round of good talks. And I wish everyone a great night. Thanks for coming out, and hopefully see you soon in the next meetup.
Have a nice evening.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.